The Ottery song, written by that Otterygian and judge of the High Court, Bernard Lord Coleridge, for the Otterygian Society in London, is now read by another Otterygian, Mrs. Mitchell, formerly Ciss Mitchell.
There is a place, dear native place, amid the meadows fair, between the hills, beside the stream, where blows the soft light air. O Ottery dear, O Ottery fair, my heart goes out to thee. Thou art my home, where'er I roam. The west for me. Sweet breathing kine, the old grey church, the curfew tolling slow, the glory of the western sky, the warm red earth below. O Ottery dear, O Ottery fair, my heart goes out to thee. Thou art my home where'er I roam. The west for me. The whistling cock, the tumbling weir, the cave where pixies dwell, the sweet old place which gave us birth, we know, we love it well. O Ottery dear, O Ottery fair, my heart goes out to thee. Thou art my home where'er I roam. The west for me. Then let us clasp each other's hands, our childhood's love renew. We stand together round the world, for Ottery hearts are true. O Ottery dear, O Ottery fair, my heart goes out to thee. Thou art my home where'er I roam. The west for me.
Many of us remember with affection Miss Fanny Pike, who, in her 50 years as mistress of the infant school, started us off on our way through life. After many pleasant years of retirement amongst us, she has passed on at the age of 94. Her successor, Miss A.J. Tait, pays this tribute to dear old Fanny Pike.
I first met Miss Pike just before her retirement at the end of 1933, when I came down to Ottery for an interview. She looked hale and hearty, full of vitality and the joy of living. I remember thinking to myself, well, if a headmistress can look like that on the eve of her retirement, then Ottery St. Mary must be a good place in which to live, and the infant school a happy place in which to work. I have never had any cause to change my mind. Now, some 33 years later on, my own experience bears out the truth of those first impressions revealed to me in those rosy cheeks and twinkling eyes of Miss Pike.
It was while he was settling the affairs of Miss Pike that her nephew, Mr. F.H. Bamfield, came across a book containing some interesting notes on the town and district, and it is from this book that he now reads.
Starting with the year 1738, it is recorded that a parish workhouse to contain 200 was ordered to be erected near St. Saviour's Bridge. This is the bridge near the railway station. The workhouse remained for 100 years until it was closed in 1838, and the inmates transferred to the Union House at Honiton. Mention is made of the factory, which is the building now occupied by the Ottermill Switchgear Company. The foundation stone of this was laid by Sir George Young and John Dancy, Esquire, in 1788. The factory was intended for the manufacture of serge, called Long L's, for the East India Company. Sometime later, in 1823, it was converted from a woolen to a silk factory. In 1803, doubtless under the threat of invasion by Napoleon, temporary barracks were erected at West Hill to house troops raised locally. This building, which was demolished after the Peace of Paris in 1814, gave its name to Barrack Road and was situated just beyond where the King's School now stands, on the opposite side of the road. The three bridges in Ottery St Mary, St Saviour's, Cadet and Gosford, together with a more distant one at Fenison, now known as Fenny Bridges, all share the distinction of being washed away. Cadet and Fenny Bridges in 1808, Gosford Bridge in 1824, and St Saviour's in 1849. The first stones of the churches at Escott and Tipton St John were laid in 1838, and those of St Michael's, West Hill, in 1845. Water was piped to the town in 1852, replacing 6 pumps which had previously been the only public source of supply. The town was lighted by gas in 1865. Other dates are mentioned of events before 1738 and after 1865, but these relate to matters which will be dealt with by others in their special fields.
Without doubt, our lovely Church of St. Mary, standing as it does, high on the hill, is the main feature of this town. Here is a talk on its history, given by that well-known authority, Mr. John Whitham.
I suppose the story of any town or village must be largely that of its church, around which it has developed since earliest beginnings. The Church of St Mary of Ottery, set on its hill in the green valley of the Otter, has stood here for more than 600 years as a lasting reminder of the glory of God amid the changing scenes of history. It was in the year 1061 that Edward the Confessor fixed the bounds of the manor and parish of Ottery by royal charter, and for the salvation and redemption of his soul, he granted it to the canons of the Cathedral Church of St Mary at Rouen in Normandy. Although the Domesday Book makes no mention of any church at Ottery, I think it likely that there was one, for the town is among the oldest in Devon. Anyway, in 1191 it is recorded that Peter the Clerk resigned and was succeeded by Roger the Chaplain. The earliest record as to the existence of a church here is to be found in the register of Walter de Bronscombe, Bishop of Exeter, who consecrated the church on Thursday, the 4th of December, 1259. It was, however, in 1337 that Ottery St Mary was to enter the greatest period in her history. She owes much to John de Grandison, who became Bishop of Exeter in 1328, and shortly afterwards chose Ottery St Mary as being the most suitable place to found his College of Canons. It was pleasant, fertile, and salubrious, and moreover was in the vicinity of Exeter, so that he could, without prejudice to his episcopal obligations, watch it fondly and attend to its rising growth. And so, after difficult negotiations, Grandison succeeded in recovering the manor and church from the canons of Rouen, who had held it for nearly 300 years. King Edward III granted his royal license on the 15th of December, 1337, for the foundation of this great collegiate church. What a triumph this must have been for Bishop Grandison. The small early church was transformed and moulded into a model of Exeter Cathedral. Grandison unroofed the original transepts and raised them as massive twin towers. In 1342, the church was completed and flourished as a college for over 200 years. Henry VI came here on the 15th of July, 1452, and stayed 2 nights, being received with great solemnity by the canons. The next royal visitor was Henry VII, who was on his way to Shute to visit his brother-in-law, Thomas Grey, Marquis of Dorset. Lord Grey had married Lady Cicely Bonville, a direct descendant of Bishop Grandison's sister, Catherine, Countess of Salisbury. We have to thank her for the beautiful Dorset Isle, which was added in 1519. It contains a rich example of fan vaulting, which was a distinctive feature of English perpendicular architecture. The Reformation was soon to follow, with the overthrow of the monasteries and the great religious houses. On the 28th of May, 1545, the warden and canons surrendered, and considerable desecration of our beautiful church resulted. Then, by letters patent, dated the 24th December in that same year, Henry VIII decreed that there should be 4 local residents as governors, in whom the church, churchyard, and clergy buildings should be vested, and that they should have succession forever. In 1552, Edward VI appointed 8 assistant governors to deal mainly with financial matters, and this constitution has continued to the present day. The church was to suffer further damage during the Great Civil War. The stained glass windows and many carved oak benches were destroyed during this time. In the Georgian period, the Reverend John Coleridge came to Ottery St Mary, and after becoming master of the King's School, was appointed vicar. His 13th and youngest child was the poet and philosopher, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was born on the 21st of October 1772 at the vicar's house. In that lovely poem, Frost at Midnight, he recalls memories of his boyhood. I dreamt of my sweet birthplace, and the old church tower, whose bells, the poor man's only music, rang from morn to evening all the hot fair day, so sweetly that they stirred and haunted me with a wild pleasure, falling on mine ear most like articulate sounds of things to come. Early in Victoria's reign, I am sorry to say, the church had a degraded and neglected appearance. And so in May 1849, extensive restoration work commenced under that zealous restorer, William Butterfield. Having originally been a collegiate foundation, it had proved of inconvenient design for use as a parish church, and Butterfield succeeded in opening out the building and making it more suited to parochial worship. 18 years later, the walls of the south transept, or bell tower, were tiled with mosaics, quite out of keeping with the medieval work, but considered beautiful by the Victorians. And then in 1935, the niches of the altar screen were filled with figures of the saints, after having been empty and bare for so long. Among the treasures of our church are the ancient clock, Grandison's gilded eagle lectern, the Tudor bench ends, the Sherman brasses, the little side chapels of St. Stephen and St. Lawrence, the beautiful altar screen with its colourful cornice, and opposite Butterfield's marble font, don't miss the charming little elephant's head, carved in stone nearly 450 years ago. This great collegiate church was in its day renowned throughout the West. So let us not forget that this is a living church, built to the glory of God by our ancestors, a rich and treasured inheritance, which has been passed down to us through the years.
If you can follow the Devonshire dialect, that's proper. 'Cause now you begin to hear 3 old codgers yarning together about the times they had in this town when they was young. Now they be all retired, but I know them very well. There's Ern Luxton. He was a farmer. Some 50 year ago, he and his missus kept the key their pub called the Railway Inn. 'Twas opposite the factory, but been closed down there a long time. There's Jack Whitham. He was a brickie. And then there's Bessie Salter. He used to haul in timber to Harry Shiner's sawmills. He'd got a team of beautiful Godfrey gosses, and he wanted them too, 'cause some of them there trees was real tremendous in size. Hey, where be you going to? You bide quiet and let's hear what they gotta say.
Well, poor Harry Shiner's dead and gone,
Yeah.
but there's nobody that took his place.
Well, right, was the reason.
No, the horses used to, now just come in lorries now, and different altogether to what it used to be.
You used just to haul in the wood, didn't you?
Yes, well, of course, it's different now than this. I mean, years ago, it was all rolled up on the carriages for skids, you see, and today they simply fix it up. There's no ingenuity in loading it or anything.
No.
You had to be used to tying your noosing the chain to allow for your butt end to come on with the same rate as a small end, but now they simply pick them up and load them. I remember being down the Wimple once, done by the horses, and I had a gentleman come along one day. I was riding along on the shafts of 3 horses, and this gentleman shouted to me, "Hey, where's your 4-horse rein?" I said, "You're my answer." He said, "But where's your off rein?" Never interesting, I said. Well, and he said, "Supposing," he said, "you want your 4-horse to go to the offside of the road." Oh, I simply shouted, "Bug off short," and he went right across the road. He said, "Very good. Maybe good enough for you, but not for me. In future, you have your 2 reins." So after that, I had to have 2 reins.
Oh, what about all that deep snow we had back long ago? Back in 1903, when there was deep snow there.
Aye.
Well, we started off like youngsters. We went up as far as Chanway and rode a small snow till we come to a big one. Then we got down as far, right in through the Slade Road, right on down to Broad Street, down through Young Street rather, down Broad Street, and we was about 8 foot high. And we couldn't move no more, so we had our photo taken there.
That's when you got your trousers wet,
That's right.
wasn't it?
That's why I got my trousers wet. And that's, then there was a market. We used to have a market there in Broad Street. And from there they used to go up to in the town hall and have the poultry show. From there they used to come out, all the stalls and all like after the cattle was tied up in different pens. And that's how they carried on.
And that was old Joe's job for years and years. And you know, I bought the beetle and an iron bar on when he got when the show finished out there, and he didn't need no more. And I got that out on there.
Have you really?
There.
Broad Street was cobbled in them days when they earned.
Pardon?
Broad Street was cobbled in those
Oh,
days.
yes,
Oh,
there
yeah.
used to be a stream of water running down through there then,
That's right.
Yeah.
in Broad Street.
Yeah, right in through yonder.
Yes, there's a market there, and the fat stock was always held up to the church.
That's right.
And they had to well around to the church and go halfway over the hill, and up the high line with all the pigs. And now there were some pigs there too. Different what you see today. The little squall, the little squall little things today, them kill before they get any size.
Any size,
Well, they used to be 10, 11 score apiece. Blimmin' great pigs they was too. But No, they kills them boilers and he tastes in the night.
Well, there's no bacon attached.
No, there's no fat bacon day.
There's nothing but good book lettuce when it's fried out.
No, and fat bacon you can get for drippings a pound. You don't get as much fat bacon as you like, but drippings a pound. And interlinked bacon for sixpence. And now look at it today. There's nobody knows the way to cook it.
There's a butcher, a retired butcher here in the town now, that I bought 100 weight of bacon off of for 2pence a pound.
As you're saying.
And fat bacon about 4 inches wide.
Yeah.
And if that there gentleman's listening to me, he bear me out, and he don't live very far from where I live now.
There.
That was bacon in these days.
Haha, Jack Whitcomb got his trousers wet because the photograph of the snowball was taken with him and 2 others sitting on top of it. The Congregational Church in this town has a most interesting past, some details of which are recalled by the secretary, Mrs. G.M. Tucker.
The independent chapel, now known as the Congregational Church, was established in Ottery in 1662, chiefly by the efforts of the Vicar of Tellerton, the Reverend Robert Collins, who would not accept the Elizabethan prayer book. He lived in the chanter's house near the parish church, and it was he who entertained Fairfax during the Civil War in 1642. The present building was erected in 1688 in the style of brick known as Flemish bond. Box seats and a gallery were in the original design, but these were removed in 1899 when the church was remodelled. A trapdoor was provided in the floor under the pulpit to enable the minister to make a getaway in times of persecution. This fact, no doubt, accounted for the name given to church members even to this day of little doormen. The organ was installed in 1876, and about this there is an amusing incident. The church secretary, who sat near the organ, noticed that the organ blower often dozed off during the sermon. This exasperated him, and one Sunday, on hearing the last hymn announced and no sound from the organ, he picked up his hymn book and flung it with great force at the man. There were no further complaints. The church records tell of the death of the cordwainer and his wife, who in 1793 were working in the factory, now owned by the Ottermill Switchgear Company. They were torn to pieces by a large wheel which they set in motion on the Sabbath. At the funeral service, those present were exhorted to mend their ways, lest the Lord deal with them likewise. 2 funeral boards, which in early times were carried in the funeral processions, are still to be seen on the walls. Each bears the coat of arms of a local family, but much detail has been obliterated by age. Church records also show that in the last century, members were dismissed for lying, debts, bad language, etc., and a certain lady was refused membership 11 times for her worldly ways. During and after the last war, church rooms were used as a food office. Congregationalists are indeed grateful that this building is in such a fine state of preservation today.
It was round about midday on a Thursday in May 1866 that fire broke out in a baker's shop, which was a lean-to against the present boys' school building in Yonder Street. It quickly spread and was not halted until the evening of the following day, but by then a large part of the town had been destroyed. It must be borne in mind that at this time most roofs of houses were thatched. Later I shall refer to a recent conversation I had with Mr. Sidney Rowe, both of our families having an interest in this, the great fire of Ottery St. Mary. My information is first-hand from 2 people, one a Mrs. Brown, who will be mentioned later, and the other Mr. Harry Jeffrey, who farmed Ramble Farm at Wiggerton for many years, and who was a pupil in the school at the time. He told me that because of the danger, the boys were kept in throughout the dinner hour. On his way home, he found both sides of Jesu Street had been destroyed, as had also the Red Lion. This was a coaching inn, which then stood on the corner side of Tip Hill, now occupied by a fish shop. The fire quickly ran up that side of the hill, or up Tipple Head, as it was often called. Then, fanned by a strong east wind, the flames leapt across to the other side, and that was burnt out, right down and around the corner to what is now the entrance to the Madrist convent. Then it was discovered that houses on the opposite side of the street had caught fire, but this was soon under control. Among those helping was a solicitor, Mr. Davy, whose house stood on the present site of the convent. In the excitement, no one had noticed that the rear of his house was alight, but by now it was completely gutted. The fire swept around Broad Street and down Mill Street, burning houses on the south side. Number 7 escaped, possibly because it had a tiled roof. This is the house where I was born, hence my family's interest. My father's eldest sister, Mary, scratched on a pane of glass in the dining room window, M.E. Godfrey, May 25th, 66. And that pane has remained in position until a few months ago, when I was able to acquire it. The fire carried on, burning all in its path until it reached St. Saviour's. All this time the wind had been blowing steadily from the east, but during the night it veered around to the south. And now we hear from Sid Rowe.
Well, the factory got a fire, and they called in the fire engines from Exeter, 2 fire engines, which they called in and put out and let the water from the river.
A river or the mill stream?
Oh, the mill stream,
I expect it was a mill stream, yeah.
And carried on up the street as far as the fire worked up the street as far as the convent.
They saved the factory and the mill and the tan yard.
The mill and the tan yard.
And these houses along here were well known.
Yes.
Up as far and including Colby House.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
And then you see it jumped over Colby House, and eventually from, what's the name of it?
Raleigh House.
Raleigh House, and it carried on from there, which you can see today. The houses was what was burned.
Yeah.
You see the brick front and the back. It shows that the back was repaired from the old houses, because
the stones,
because they shows black, which anybody could see if they see it from the
High Street.
the back of the houses.
The fire pursued its path of destruction until it was stopped in Broad Street. On the following Sunday evening, a woman evangelist from Exeter seized her opportunity and held a meeting on the corner of Tip Hill opposite the burned-out Red Lion. Mrs. Brown was one of the audience, and she told me of a tall chimney, which should have been shored up, but wasn't. And while the woman was preaching about hellfire, this chimney fell, killing 3. And now we hear from Sid Rowe again, this time learning of his family's interest.
I had an auntie, was one of them.
One of the 3.
One of the 3 was killed, and she still lies in the congregational chapel there. The
Churchyard,
the churchyard, and the red stone shows the time of the big. Well, you can see with the date, if you see the date on the stone, you can fall back to when the big fire was.
Yeah.
Soon after I made this recording, I was given a picture, the painting of which is on the reverse side of a piece of glass. It had belonged to a family whose home, like that of so many others, was destroyed by the fire. and it is one of the few possessions that this family took with them when they spent the Thursday night by the side of the road near Galway. The Coleridge family has always been closely linked with the town, and here the present holder of the title, Richard Lord Coleridge, speaks of his family and the connection.
As you've just heard, I've been asked by my old friend, Fred Godfrey, to add a few words to his record of Ottery St. Mary and of some of those who have been fortunate enough to have lived their lives in this corner of Devon. He's asked me to talk of our family and of our home, the Chanter's House, which originally formed part of the monastic college whose buildings were grouped around the church and which was founded in the 14th century by John de Grandison, then Bishop of Exeter. Ancestors of ours, the Duke family of Ottery, leased the Chanter's House in Tudor times, first from the church and later, after the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII, from the Duke of Somerset, the Lord Protector, to whom Henry had given the college lands he had seized from the church. The Coleridges can lay no claim to being one of the oldest families of Ottery. Many families go back far longer than we do, but we have been continuously here since John Coleridge, whose family came from the village of Coleridge in mid-Devon, was appointed Vicar of Ottery and Master of the King's School some 200 years ago. One of the vicar's sons was the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and another was James, the Colonel, who we regard as the founder of our family in Ottery, and who married Miss Duke of Ottery, whose family had first lived in the Chanter's House 2 centuries earlier, and it was he, James Coleridge, who bought back the house in which the family has lived ever since. The Colonel raised a regiment of foot and fought with Napoleon in Spain, and it was his eldest son, Sir John Coleridge, who was the first of the line of 3 judges of the High Court, of whom the second was Lord Chief Justice of England, and the third was my grandfather. It was the Lord Chief Justice who, alas, decided that his home, which had once housed Oliver Cromwell and Fairfax, was too small for him. He overlaid the medieval buildings with the Anglican Gothic structure which exists today. But happily, the core of the old house remains as it always was, including the great parlour, in which, in the fall of the year 1645, a number of members of Parliament presented Sir Thomas Fairfax with a fair jewel, which they hung about his neck in recognition of his signal services at the Battle of Naseby. Mr. Godfrey, I've rambled on far too long, but may I end on a personal note? 6 months ago, another James Coleridge was born in the Chanter's House, the 7th generation in a direct line of our family to be born there. And God willing, he too will live in peace and happiness in the shadow of the great church and within the music of its bells.
The Illustrated London News for May 1866 reported the Great Fire of Ottery St. Mary. With the report were 2 sketches, one of which depicted a large building standing erect amidst its burnt-out neighbours. Brief mention of this house is made by Mrs. Bishenden, who before she was married was Winnie Salter.
Raleigh House, that imposing building which is situated in Mill Street, opposite the Wesleyan Chapel, is considered by many to be the birthplace of Sir Walter Raleigh, but this is not so. He was born at Hayes Barton, East Budleigh, about 10 miles distant, where he lived until he commenced his adventurous career upon the high seas, and as a favourite at the court of Queen Elizabeth I. When he retired, he tried to buy back Hayes Barton, but could not do so. He then bought the largest of a group of 5 houses which at that time stood around the site of the present Raleigh House. The house was one of those destroyed by fire in 1805, and all that remains of the original house is a cheerful carved head, which is now the centrepiece over the entrance to this fine Georgian building.
At the nativity of Christ our Lord, the angels did rejoice with one accord. Let Christians imitate them here on earth and crown this day with joy and pious mirth. 12 o'clock, a bright moonlit morning.
That is the voice of my cousin, Henry Godfrey, who, standing on the church steps at midnight, Christmas Eve, is carrying on the tradition of proclaiming the Nativity. Now he will proceed around the town, stopping at various places to repeat the proclamation, and maybe to partake of some light refreshment. Speaking to him just now, I asked him if he would call and talk to us about this age-old custom, and he promised if he is not too tired, when he finishes, he will do so. It is now 20 minutes to 3 o'clock on Christmas morning, and very tired, but true to his word, here is Henry. Here we are again, and Henry, and thank you very much for coming in.
Yes, another year's come round, Fred. That time passes along, doesn't it?
It does, too true.
Yes.
I suppose you've had your usual good wishes, coupled with a drink and the traditional mince pie, each signifying a happy month?
Yes, yes. Several calls to make, you know, Fred.
Oh, yes. Well, can you tell us something of this tradition, Henry?
Yes. You remember the late Lord Bernard Coleridge, the last judge?
Yes.
He told Uncle Sid that this custom went back to the Middle Ages. And I don't know what authority he had it on, but he was one of the greatest scholars that Ottery produced, and I'm prepared to take his word for it.
Can't go wrong,
You remember, or you wouldn't, do you remember your grandfather,
Yes.
You know your grandfather?
No, not my grandfather, no.
John Godfrey?
No.
My great-grandfather?
No.
He was appointed bellman of Ottery St. Mary Church in 1836. Well, he had an uncle, I rather think he was called Charles, but I'm not sure about this. And his father was the town crier of Ottery St. Mary towards the end of the 18th century.
No.
And part of the town crier's job in that day was to call out the washerwomen on Monday mornings. He used to go round before daybreak on Monday morning, every Monday morning, to call out the washerwomen. You never heard that before?
I never heard that.
No? Well, we think that he proclaimed the nativity as well, because the criers of Ottery carried that on until somewhere around 1880.
And then there was a bit of trouble one year, or over 2 or 3 years perhaps, and the vicar asked my grandfather, George Godfrey, if he would take on the job of proclaiming the Nativity, which he did. And he handed it down to my father, John, and about 1930, I took it on.
Yeah, good old record.
And for about the last 30 odd years, I've been assisted by Nelson Owen.
Yes.
He's been
Yes.
a good old supporter.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Incidentally, my Uncle George, your grandfather,
Yes.
He had the family team. Can you just tell us about that a moment?
Yes, well, as I told you earlier on, great-grandfather John Godfrey was appointed bellman of Ottery, and he carried that on until he was succeeded by grandfather George. And his 7 sons were all ringers. So with their father, they could ring the Ottery bells.
Well, thanks very much indeed, old man. I don't want to keep you any longer. I expect you'll be glad to get back.
We're a bit of it.
Oh,
Leg weary, you know.
Yeah.
Covering a few miles, you know, Ottery grows bigger every year.
Yeah, that's too true, too true. Well, we'll just have that drink and we'll say good night.
Thank you very much, Fred.
Thank you, Henry, I'm sure.
Happy Christmas to you.
Thank you, old man, and the same to you and many yet.
Thank you.
The following extracts from the History of the King's School, compiled and written by the history master, Mr. Geoffrey Holmes, are read by the headmaster, Mr. Sid Andrew.
This really, you know, should all be done by you, because after all you were a pupil and a governor here at this school, and I've only been headmaster for about 18 years. Well now, the King's School, the origin of the King's School lies in the choir school of Bishop Grandison's Ecclesiastical College, founded in 1337. And the college was dissolved in 1545, and the choir school came to an end. King Henry VIII was persuaded, probably by John Hayden of Cadhay, to found in its place the King's New Grammar Schole of St. Mary Ottery. The master, who was to be nominated by the church governors and the vicar, was to be paid £10 a year, and schooling was to be free for the boys who attended it. Inflation in the 16th and 17th centuries, however, soon made the £10 salary comparatively valueless, and the masters began to take fee-paying pupils. Gradually these took precedence, and by the 18th century the school had become a private boarding and day school with room for only 2 free scholars under Salter's charity of 1666. The school had many vicissitudes. Originally, it was housed in a single-storied building opposite the church, and as far as we know, it remained on that site until 1881. Now, in 1587, it was consumed and brent with fire, but rebuilt for the sum of above £40 through the generosity of John Hayden and his wife Joan. During the last 40 years of the 17th century, the school flourished under the Reverend Greaves Austin with almost 200 scholars, but his successor, Richard Marker, reduced it to be without 1 scholar. The Reverend Richard Home and the Reverend John Coleridge did something to restore its name, but their successors again neglected it, so that when John's son, the Reverend George Coleridge, became the headmaster in 1795, he found the premises in a ruinous state, and the schoolroom was used for keeping rabbits and poultry. Under the Reverend George, however, and his 2 successors, Dr. John Warren and Dr. Sidney Cornish, the school became very well known in the West Country,
and during a spell of about 70 years, 712 pupils attended it either as boarders or day boys. They included many Coleridges, Samuel Taylor, the poet, among them, Kennaways, Cornishes, Archers, Northcotes, Simcoes and Youngs, all well-known West Country families. A register kept by the Reverend Sidney Cornish, listing 579 of these pupils, is a treasured possession of the school today. Many of the boys entered the church, some the services and others the law. Bishops, judges, colonial governors and MPs are among them, one of the most noted being John Coleridge Patterson, the first Bishop of Melanesia, martyred in 1861. Some of them, of course, were not quite such worthy individuals. There's one entry in the register which I personally like very much. It was apparently a George Collins who was, as the headmaster said, sent from school for refusing to do an imposition, having sworn not to do it, dated Lady Day 1825, and a footnote at the bottom of the page, written 20 years later, says, "He came here the 25th of August 1845 in a very seedy state and borrowed a sovereign." Unfortunately for the school, the Reverend George Smith, who followed Dr. Cornish as headmaster in 1863, allowed it to run down to such an extent that it had to be closed in 1881. When it was reopened in 1895, its character had changed. No longer was it a school for educational grammar school in Devon, with 46 boys and 12 girls. I think you, Fred, were among that number. Now, expansion in the first 2 decades of the century was associated with a powerful personality of Mr. Wyatt. He became headmaster in 1900 of a school of 28 pupils, and when he retired in 1923, there were over 10 times that number, about 1/4 of whom held free places. Mr. Johnson had to face the difficulties of a contracting school during the 1920s and 30s for the slump after the Great War, and the economic crisis of 1929-31 greatly reduced the numbers of fee payers. Further difficulties followed during the war years, when money for educational reforms was non-existent. But as a result of the Butler Education Act of 1944 and the abolition of fees, the period since then has been one of, I think, continuous expansion. First of all, under Mr. Crowther in 1946, and I've had the honour to serve the school as headmaster since 1950. Instead of the 1 laboratory for chemistry built in 1912, there are now 4 laboratories catering for 3 sciences. In 1963, there was also opened a new hall cum gymnasium with a fine stage, changing rooms and showers. There have also been added a new art room, domestic science room, library and classrooms. The 56 pupils of 1912 have risen to 450 now, including 243 girls. Most of these now come by bus. There are 5 sixth forms numbering nearly 100 altogether, staying on till 18 or 19 years of age, and the 5 teachers of 1912 have become 26 in 1968. The latest addition to the amenities is a fine swimming pool opened in 1966. But whatever the future of the school may be, we can't escape altogether from our past, which every now and then catches up with us in some incident, great or small. Within the last 3 months, for example, 2 events have occurred to remind the school of something in its past history. The opening of the Northcote Theatre, the finest centre for drama in the southwest, represented one aspect of the munificence of the Devon millionaire, Mr. G.V. Northcote, who as a boy travelled daily by train from Otterton to attend the King's School in its priory days. And the second thing, from nearly a century earlier, comes a scrap of paper and a George III token found recently at the end of a passage under the church roof. For on an autumn day in 1819, 3 boys of Dr. Warren's school, that's what the King's School was then, penetrated to that spot and left these mementos of their escapade. One grew up to become a surgeon in Plymouth, another to be the rector of Woodworthy. Of the third we know nothing, except his name and the fact that he was just one of the many hundreds who in the course of over 4 centuries have been educated at King Henry VIII's new grammar school of St. Mary, Ottery.
On the other side of this tape, we heard 3 elderly local gentlemen who were chatting together. We now butt in on a conversation between 3 equally well-known ladies. They are Mrs. Louie Hellier, Senior, who was 84 years old at the time of the recording, her daughter-in-law, Mrs. Louise Hellier, and a great friend, Mrs. Bessie Welsman.
What about the time when we used to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning and go up Mrs. Pyle's mopping on the 21st of December? And then we used to tell Mrs. Pyle that we had brothers and sisters home and we wanted a penny for them. See?
Yes, I've done that heaps of times.
That's the time.
I've done that heaps of times. Been out and said, oh, my sister's out in the drive, can you give me a penny for her? Are you sure, dear? Oh, positive? I said,
yes.
Yes.
And I never had no brothers.
No, and I run down Slade Road laughing like anything to think I had extra penny for my sister. That's for Christmas.
Henry Godfrey just now. Did you enjoy that?
Yes. Yes, very much I did. I enjoyed him very much. And I'd like to hear him come around every Christmas. I sit up and listen for him to come.
Oh, and another thing, what we used to like and always look forward to is Work Mondays for the Otterygians. And it gets trimmed up for the weekends, these strands and the arches and everything, the streets was done up lovely.
Yes.
Go down and meet them 3:30 to 4. The Institute for breakfast, dinner and tea in the street, sports around the town.
Yeah.
Down and see them off again in the night. What a day for Ottery.
Yeah.
You tell me who's better than they days.
Well,
all of us all together enjoying ourselves.
Well,
My goodness, bring them back where everybody is more together. Instead of so much television. People aren't the same today. I don't know if you think so, but I don't.
Well, I used to go down and sell them all my pints. All the Londoners here early in the morning. And they used to give me 6pence a punch. I used to sell out. My father was so pleased when I got home with all my baskets. I enjoyed that. And then I used to walk up behind the den, right up Mill Street.
Where do you pick them up?
I used to have to pick them in the night before to get ready for the Londoners. Of course I did. I had to go to the station, you know, that's all. I enjoyed it. It was happy days.
Outside Blackpool.
Yes, outside Blackpool. I used to have the baskets.
The pub used to be open.
Yes, I know.
And I'll tell you another time I used to cry for laughing. Was when I used to go up Wardale. Poor Crafty used to come on by our works. Never suffered with bronchitis in they days like I have. He said, back in they days, what you wants to do will be the newspaper back in front. He said, you never suffer with bronchitis.
But I was
Go back.
Who was it who used to dance down yonder street? Was there someone on the 1st of May every year?
Yeah, that was an old woman at the top end of yonder street. Or used to come down and carry her maypole stick, eye up with flowers, and her hat trimmed all up with flowers. You never see such a sight in all your life.
Well,
you've never seen
First of May.
1st of May.
Yeah, but you always used to dance in maypole, didn't
Yes. For us, nothing more than sister.
Yeah. Well, you don't see they do it, no.
I used to teach us the way to dance in Maypole. It used to be lovely times. We used to dance up in the square.
That's right.
All the
Yes.
there's no times like that. I don't
No.
care what anybody says. We shall never have them times again, Louie.
No.
There was somebody else at a chapel up in Fudsborough, wasn't there?
Quacky Ilna.
Oh. Yes, yes.
Quacky used to...
He used to sing the devil away.
He used to come every so often.
Yes.
And he'd gather a lot of people around him.
Yeah.
And he'd sing hymns and that, and then he'd say he was chasing the devil out of us all.
Didn't he draw a circle, scratch a circle on the surface of the road and dance around it, beating the devil inside?
Beating a thing, like a drum.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
That's all quack.
But then I remember that time I was running across there to Jack Redder's one Saturday morning, and when he was doing the Pixie Cave, and there was a lot of visitors here. And they said to me, whatever's on tonight here, what are they doing there? Oh, I said, the Pixies is getting about. Pixies? Never heard of such a thing, didn't he? Well, I said, if you're down with us, you'll soon hear it. What will I do? Well, I said, you better be careful, missus. I said, because you need to get pixie lit. Isn't that right, Mr. Godfrey? What's that, Lou? Says Mr. Godfrey. Well, I just told them if they wants to be careful, they don't want to get pixie lit, they let them wear their drawers in and out tonight.
Well, I suppose
says
that's
Mr. Godfrey, that's right.
I suppose that's why the population of Ottery grows so they don't take pixies all too often. That's what happened, They went down Pixie's collar because there used to be crowds that go in a couple of times. They did, they always went there.
Well, it was good old times, wasn't it?
Oh, just good old times,
yes. And never have them again.
Oh.
No, just love life.
Years ago, in this part of the country, folk believed that the wearing of an article of clothing, inside out, protected them from pixie spells. Lady Barbara William Powlett now tells us something about Cat.
Caddy is not mentioned in the Domesday Book. It appears first in about 1300 during the reign of Edward I and was held by de Caddy, and is from this family that the house gets its name. The last de Caddy heiress married a Hugh Grenville, and in 1527 it was given to their daughter Joan on her marriage to John Hayden. Thus Caddy passed to the Haydens, who had occupied for 200 years. Riston, in his survey of Devon, writes that John Hayden builded at Caddy a fair new house and enlarged his domain. But this is not quite a true picture, as part of the house still remains. It was at the time when King Henry VIII was dissolving the monasteries, and in 1545 the warden of Bishop Grandison's College of Priests in Ottery surrendered to the king. And the king, by royal charter, made 4 local gentlemen governors of the church. John Hayden was one of these 4 original governors, and in building his fair new house at Caddy, he seems to have made very good use of the stone from the deserted college buildings. This same John Hayden and his wife built the bridge between Caddy and Ottery, which is said once to have borne the inscription, "John and Joan built me, pray good people repair me." Caddy passed to his great nephew Robert, who built the south side of the house with the ladies' gallery. He married Joan Powlett, daughter of Sir Amias Powlett, quite an important person in the reign of Queen Elizabeth. He was at one time ambassador to the court of France, and was also keeper to Mary Queen of Scots until she was executed. And we feel that Joan may have been used to much larger houses than this small Devon manor house, and persuaded her husband to build her a ladies' gallery, which was so popular at this time. It was from this family that my husband is descended, and though my father-in-law only came to Caddy in 1924, we feel we have been connected with the house and with Ottery and Mary for very much longer.
There is a popular belief hereabouts, even almost a legend, that Tait and the church are connected by an underground passage. Is there any truth in this?
Well, we have often been told of this, but alas, we have never found the passage. And I should think it is very unlikely, owing to the difficulty of tunnelling under the river.
Thank you.
History of Ottery. Newcomers are often curious about the brickworks, which are situated about a mile to the east of the town. Here, the manager, Jeff Woodley, is answering some of those queries. How long ago were the works constructed, Jeff?
I don't know the actual date, Fred, but Father was there over 50 years before me, and his father told him that when he was a lad, he could remember seeing the present chimney being built, and they were wheeling the bricks across from the other side of the road, where the reservoir is now, on planks which were down across the road and which were down night and day while they were building the chimney.
It wouldn't do for modern traffic conditions, would
It
it?
certainly wouldn't, no.
And how high is the chimney?
It's 90 feet now, Fred. It used to be 120, and about 10 years ago we took the top 30 feet off because there was a rather nasty twist in it, and we thought it was best to have it down. People sometimes say, well, we don't see very much coming out of the chimney, but in fact we burn over 20 tons of coal a week, and the actual moisture, which has got to be driven out of the brick before we bring the fire onto it, of course goes up the stack, and that amounts to about 50 tons of water or steam a week.
50 tons?
Yes.
Now, Joe, the fire itself, it burns night and day, or what?
Oh yes, it's a continuous process. It was made a continuous kiln in about 1925, and apart from a couple of years during the war when they closed down, the fire's been in ever since. It takes about a fortnight to do the cycle of the kiln.
What, from the...
Well, the bricks are in the kiln a fortnight.
Yeah, I see. Before they come out complete.
Before they come out burnt, yes.
They used to be dried, did they? Or what were the procedures in the open air, didn't they?
Yes, when they were making handmade bricks, they were stacked outside, and the sun and the wind then dried them. But of course, the snag was in frosty weather. If the frost got at them while they were still wet, of course they were ruined. But now they go direct into the kiln.
Bricks, local bricks go quite far afield. Is there some special quality about the clay that you use?
Well, it's a very plastic clay, Fred, and it also burns quite a bright red colour, and it lends itself to the addition of sands and stains to get various colours. We do 7 colours in the facing brick, and we send them as far afield as Torquay, Bournemouth, Southampton, Bristol even we've sent them.
Now, Joe, your father was telling me some time ago something about a problem he had when the present King's School was being built.
That's right. It was built with all our handmade bricks, and the actual tiles were our tiles as well. We were making tiles in those days, and the architect wanted a sand-faced tile as well as a sand-faced brick, and this hadn't previously been done. And they did several experiments, but in the end it had to be, the sand had to be rubbed into the tile by hand. So it was quite a lengthy business, but it made a very good job of it, and well, as people can see today, it looks very good still.
Yes, so I've heard. What other buildings locally use your brick?
The Cottage Hospital, of course, the Institute, and most of the other big buildings, the factory, Quite a lot of buildings actually in the area.
That would be the earlier portion of it, the older
the
portion
factory
of
would
the
be built with the earlier brickworks, not the present one.
Is there anything special in the process that you feel might interest listeners? Can you think of anything at all?
Well, it says all machine-made bricks now, Fred. We do about 50% ordinary common bricks, and the rest are facing bricks. No handmades in those days.
It's not a question doesn't appertain to the history of the brickworks, but what was it you were saying that funny episode some time ago?
We had a character that used to be on the kiln burning, and they work in shifts, 3 8-hour shifts. And he was on the kiln one night, and he thought he'd scare the fitter who came in early each morning. So he made a dummy, complete with gloves and mask, and he hung this dummy up inside the engine room door so that when the fitter came in and switched the light on in the morning, this thing would be in front of him, you see. Well,
as if it had been someone who had hung himself.
That's right.
I see, yeah.
Well, this went off very well, and they sat this dummy in the corner of the canteen for several days. And then this burner thought to himself one day before dinner, he'd take all the stuffing out inside of it and get in it himself and sit in the same position and wait for the men to come in to have their lunch, you see. And he waited until they were all sat down, and the fellow next to him raised his mug of tea, and he just placed his hand on his shoulder and jumped about 2 feet in the air, tea everywhere.
I should think so. Well, thank you very much, Jeff. I'm sure people will be most interested.
Okay.
Nightstone, situated to the south of the town, is another house of historical interest. Here, Mrs. P. Robinson, wife of the present owner, relates some of that history.
At the end of Edward III's reign, Nightstone was owned by the de Nightstone family. In 1380, Richard de Nightstone conveyed his land to Thomas de Bittlesgate, who attached a domestic chapel to the house under license from the Bishop of Exeter. 2 of the chapel windows still exist, timber trefoil-headed lights, which cannot be later than the 14th century. Under the will of Thomas de Bittlesgate, the property passed to Baroness Harrington and Bonville, and on her death to her grandson, the Earl of Suffolk, father of Lady Jane Grey. He was executed on the failure of the plot to put his daughter on the throne, and Nightstone then passed to the crown. In 1554, Nightstone was purchased by William Sherman, a merchant of Ottery, and he is responsible for a great deal of restoration to the old house, including the massive west door and the fine panelling in the screen's passage. His son John and his wife Margaret Drake and their eldest son Richard all died on the same day in 1617. This event is recorded on brasses in Ottery Church. Their second son Gideon succeeded to Nightstone, and having no children, he left it to his widow, a Coppleston, and the estate remained with the Coppleston family until the end of the century. Dr. Drury, headmaster of Harrow, bought Nightstone in 1803 and replanned a good deal of the interior of the house. The Drury family continued to live here until 1886, when it was bought by Mr. Matthew Ellis, who was succeeded by his son in 1913. In 1941, Nightstone was bought by Colonel Cooper, whose main contribution was the making of the garden and the planting of the yew hedges, which today, after nearly 30 years, are such a beautiful feature. On Colonel Cooper's death in 1966, Nightstone was purchased by my husband, Geoffrey Robinson, who occupied it in 1967 after restoring and modernizing the house. At the same time, considerable alterations were made to the garden to simplify the general plan while preserving the best features of the original design.
just before midnight on a Wednesday, the 10th of July, 1968, something happened which had such grim consequences that it must eventually find its place in local history. Earlier in this recording, dates were given when certain of our bridges over the river were destroyed by flood. One of these, a Fennerton Bridge as it was then called, was swept away in 1808, being later replaced by a double bridge, the eastern side over the river and the western side over a mill stream. It then became known as Fenny Bridges. For what happened on this particular night, let us turn to Mr. H.J. Godfrey, who farms in this area.
It rained heavily all day, but after tea it became a torrential downpour, and very soon the whole of the Otter Valley was in flood. As it happened, an enormous amount of hay was lying in the meadows, and much of this was picked up by the flood, some of it finding its way into the weir above the mill. As more and more collected there, so the surrounding flood water rose, causing much damage to nearby houses and business premises. Finally, the weir was completely choked. Then it gave way. As by now the night was pitch dark, no one could see just what was happening, nor does there seem to be anyone who has a clear idea of what later caused the bridge over the mill stream to collapse. But collapse it did, and the pent-up water in a wave rushed down the valley, taking with it much livestock from farms, debris, trees, and more hay, together with some motor cars. In its passage, it tore down fences, swept away hedges and banks, and even sections of the surface of the approach roads to Ottery.
At this time, a van was being driven down a barrack road towards the town. When near to Island Farm, the driver saw what he described later as a 6-foot wall of water rushing at him. He jumped from the van and raced back the road, seeking protection on higher ground. The water caught him, but only waist high. Turning, he saw his van picked up like a matchbox and flung over the hedge into the farmyard. Incidentally, the name given to this farm had nothing to do with water, but was because of the fact that the farm forms a triangle of land completely surrounded by roads. The premises of a motorcar body repairer close to the railway station signal box were leveled by the rush of water. The man and his wife had narrow escapes. The caravan in which they were living remained upright, but wedged against wreckage. To avoid being drowned, they had to climb onto the top of this caravan, and from there they were later rescued by a crane, which picked them up, swung them around, and deposited them on higher ground. With the approach of daybreak, it could be seen that the sawmills, together with an engineering works close by, had been completely washed out. In fact, some of the heavier equipment only recently installed by the owner has now been located miles down the valley near Woodley, Salterton. A large caravan was floated out of the caravan site onto neighbouring ground, which happens to be a cricket field. And when the water subsided, there it lay, stranded in the centre of the pitch. The riverbank opposite the old gasworks has disappeared, thus revealing to sight the foundations of a large and only recently completed extension of the factory of the Ottery Switchgear Company. The flood continued its mad rush down the valley, and now let us hear what Mrs. Olive Wainwright, who has resided for many years in the village of Tipton St. John, and who figured prominently in the rescue operations that night, has to tell us of what happened.
We had already been flooded that night, water pouring in from Coombe Goyle, and helpers were making their way home, having cleared away the worst of the mud, when with a roar a wall of water descended upon the village, the river having burst its banks. This wall swept through the street, going in the front of the houses and out the back, and in some cases demolishing walls in its progress. People saw the bridge over the river actually lifted up in one piece before being carried downstream. There has never been such a flood recorded in the local history, the nearest being that of 1910, when the height of the water was marked on a wall which still remains. Now it is found that the level of this flood was 1 foot 5 inches above that of 1910.
On the following day, the path of destruction was clearly marked, the meadows beside the river being littered with all manner of debris, including the carcasses of animals and fowls drowned by the flood water, and a tremendous amount of hay everywhere. It was indeed a miracle that a night of such terror and destruction did not result in loss of human life nor injury to person. On one particular night every year, people flock to this town from far and wide, their purpose being to enjoy our 5th of November celebrations, the main attraction of which is the rolling of burning tar barrels through the streets. Two men who for many years past have worked hard to ensure the continuation of this tradition are here tonight. One, Bob Pike, makes himself answerable for the supply and the condition of the barrels, seeing that they are fit for burning. The other is Roy Prettyjohn, who is the secretary of the Carnival Committee. Local people always refer to our night as Ottery's 5th of November instead of Ottery's Carnival. I wonder what the reason is, Roy.
Well, I think it's the only place in the country that holds the celebrations on the actual date that the Houses of Parliament were going to be blown up on. This has gone on for many years.
Only different date being when the 5th comes on a Sunday, isn't it?
Oh, we revert to the Saturday then.
Yes. Bob, your job starts, really, as soon as 1/5 November is finished. You've got to make your preparations for the next year's 5th November, haven't you?
Oh yes, we've got to start scheduling for a few barrels in around the different farms, the usual place.
Difficult to get?
Fairly difficult to get now. I've got 1 or 2 good friends still around, supplying with a few weigh barrels.
I suppose it's because manufacturers don't pack things, animal foods and that, in the barrels like they used to, is that it?
No, I suppose it'll all come in containers soon, the old tankers, and then there'll be a job to get.
But you've got some to carry on with?
Well, I've got a few hidden away, different places.
What do you do then? What happens?
Oh, well, I keep them for a year or 2, get them thoroughly dried out, tighten all the hoops on them, and then we start repairing them.
Yes.
Soaking in paraffin, diesel oil, then we start coating them with tar. Once a week to start with.
As often as that?
Oh yeah, once a week. So we get them fairly fit, and it's every night occurrence then, weather permitting.
Well, you certainly got a job on your plate every year, haven't you? All the year round. Roy, you have a very difficult job, carnival nights. Apart from all the usual activities as secretary and seeing that things are in order, when does your real worrying period start?
Well, the chief worry's the weather. Being in November, it can be cold and wet. Then comes the line-up of the procession. That's not in my hands, but my job is to try to force or encourage the judges to hurry up with their judging, as the people on the tableaus, it's a cold old job.
Shivering and wet.
Yes. Then after the procession's away, I get down the street and dish out the prize cards, and usually end up down with a carnival bonfire.
Placing them on the tableau as you go down.
Oh yes, yes.
Of course, we are not going to be so lucky in the future. We shan't have the cooperation of a railway station master.
No, we got a narrow bridge and a turn at the station approach.
Yeah.
In the past, we've always, when we sent the procession away, we've phoned the station and they've kindly shut the gates and blocked all the traffic from the west side. And many a motorist has sat patiently waiting for British Railways train that never arrived.
All right. Bob, do you remember that time when the BBC had difficulty? Their team arrived here, and the big noise got detached from the microphone?
Oh yeah, yeah. I know we had 24 hours of rehearsing this job.
Well, with them?
With him, yeah.
Yeah. And then finally, what happened?
Oh, fine job. Got the barrel lit and everything.
Yeah. But then on the night in question...
Oh, he was there on the night in question, all right. He lit the barrel.
Yes.
And once we let it go, he said, for God's sake, get me out of this. I never saw him afterwards.
Didn't you really?
I never saw him afterwards.
I heard that he made out he got lost, but actually he was scared.
I think he just got under the window.
Dear, oh dear. This tradition of ours, no one seems to be able to trace when it came into being, the reason for our burning barrels and lighting bonfires, apart from the tableau procession, of course. That is the tradition peculiar to Ottery St. Mary. There is no other town in the country that is allowed to roll burning barrels through the streets. And I suppose, well, we accepted that once we stop, we'll never start again.
I shouldn't think so, Fred. I think once this stops, that'll be it.
Of course, it's marvellous, really. You think of it, that we've never had any serious accident, have we?
Oh, no, we've never had a serious accident at all.
No. And yet, you know...
A few high spirits, but...
I remember at the time when we wanted to insure, if you remember, Roy, what a job we had at 1 year to insure it, because the insurance company called in anyone in their department at headquarters, head office, to see if they knew anything of the Ottery Carnival, and from the report they got, they refused to insure us. Do you remember that?
Well, I think actually the trouble was that we were televised,
yeah,
and the big noises on at that time the insurance company who were insuring us just realised what they were insuring.
Yeah.
And of course we tried about 25 companies.
Yes, we did. Yeah.
Finally, we did get fixed up, and we couldn't run it without an insurance of some sort.
Well, I'm sure that that you people and such of us that are still alive will maintain this tradition as long as possible. We hope it will never disappear. And I'd like to say thank you very much for coming along and putting out this item of interest for listeners at a later date.
Yes, right. Thank you.
Right. Mr. John Whitham, whose voice we have already heard in this recording, is now reading some extracts from a local paper which appeared exactly 68 years ago today, November the 9th, 1901.
The Honiton and Ottery St. Mary Advertiser, dated Saturday, November the 9th, 1901. Report of the meeting of the Urban District Council. The meeting was held at the Town Hall on Thursday, when there were present Mr. H. Manning, Chairman, Reverend G. M. L. Reed, Messrs. W. Salter, J. Baker, H. G. Luxton, A. Cripps, H. Marks, S. C. Franks, and F. Seward. A preliminary explanation. Mr. Cripps said a good deal had been said about his bringing forward the question of a chokage in a drain in yonder street, and several of them had read the letter which Mr. Street had read to the advertiser on the matter. Mr. Street's statement that there were only 12 cottages was quite correct, and he, Mr. Cripps, never said that there were 20, this being an error in the report of the meeting. The matter had caused a little unpleasantness in the town between Mr. Street and himself, and he should like to ask the surveyor whether it was a fact that there really was any chokage. Mr. Squires said he was told that there was a chokage, and he left word at Mr. Street's shop asking that the matter might be attended to. Mr. Cripps said he was quite satisfied and could laugh at such letters as that. Officers' reports. The Treasurer, Mr. Warne, reported that there was now an adverse balance on the Council's account of £460 17 and 8pence. The Medical Officer, Dr. Reynolds, said the town and district had now been free from any notifiable disease for more than 5 months, and the general health of the district was very satisfactory. As the result of an inquiry made by a committee of the County Council, he, Dr. Reynolds, had visited the gasworks and found that no polluting effluent from the works was discharged into the river, but only the waste water from the house. Surveyor's report. The surveyor, Mr. R. Squire, reported that the weir at Waxway had been done by Mr. T. Salter, and the fencing at Barrow Hill by Mr. Payne. 2 new posts had been put in at Dunkirk Bridge. Complaints had been received of a scarcity of the water supply to 2 cottages at Coombe, and he had seen the agent of the property, Mr. Bailey of Exeter, who had arranged to have the well sunk deeper. He produced a letter from Mr. C. H. Salter complaining of a dangerous gutter at the real end of Longdog's Lane, and the clerk, Mr. Hartley, read a letter from Mr. Harris of East Hayes to the same effect. Mr. Luxton moved that a 9-inch pipe be laid down in concrete at the end of the lane by the contractor for the district, thus doing away with the danger. Mr. W. Salter seconded, and it was carried unanimously. Mr. Salter moved that the water channels in Silver Street and Ridgeway be put in repair, and this also was carried. The lighting of Tip Hill. The surveyor complained of the bad light given by the street lamps, especially at Tip Hill, where on several occasions recently one of the lamps had not been lit at all. After some discussion, Mr. Luxton moved that the company be called upon to provide a proper light at Tip Hill. Mr. Mark seconded. It having been pointed out that according to the contract the council could deduct 6pence an hour for every lamp remaining unlit. Mr. Salter moved as an amendment that the sum of 10 shillings be claimed from the company for the lamp which had not been lit at Tip Hill. Mr. Franks seconded, and on being put to the meeting, there voted for the amendment Messrs. Manning, Salter, Franks, Baker and Seward, and for the original resolution Messrs. Luxton, Marks, Cripps and Reed, the amendment being therefore carried by 5 votes to 4. Mr. Cripps thought that there should be some means of testing the lighting power of the lamps, and proposed that the clerk should ascertain from Messrs. Louie Co. of Exeter particulars and price of a testing apparatus. The resolution was carried unanimously. Allotments. The clerk stated that the allotments committee had met that afternoon, and as they did not conclude their business until after 5 o'clock, they had had no time to prepare a report. Hire of a steam roller. In reply to the council's advertisement, the following tenders were received for the hire of a steam roller. Mr. Harris, Clistheiden, 4 shillings a day, including water cart and labourer. Mr. J. Skinner, Sidmouth, £1 a day, not including water cart or extra labourer, and Messrs. Edison and D'Amato's, 25 shillings a day, the council finding fuel in each case. Mr. Salter moved that Mr. Skinner's tender be accepted. Mr. Baker seconded. Mr. Luxton moved as an amendment that Mr. Harris's tender be accepted, and on being put to the meeting, the amendment which was seconded was defeated by 7 votes to 2. Mr. Luxton then moved, and Mr. Reed seconded, that Messrs. Edison's tender be accepted. This also was defeated by 7 votes to 2, and the original resolution was carried. Mr. Luxton explained that he moved the amendments on account of the complaints which had been made by the County Council as to the cost of Mr. Skinner's roller last year. The fire engine. The clerk announced the receipt of a letter from the Commercial Union Assurance Company offering 2 guineas towards the cost of a new fire engine. The council having already decided to put the old engine in repair, the letter was allowed to lie on the table. Reports were presented by Messrs. J. Street and C.H. Salter on the work required to put the engine in repair, and it was decided to invite tenders for the same, the General Purposes Committee being given power to act in the matter. Tenders for the insurance of members of the Fire Brigade against accidents while on duty were received from the General Accident Assurance, Ocean and Commercial Union Insurance Companies. The rates were very similar in each case, and on the motion of Mr. Luxton, the tender of the Accident Insurance Company was accepted. The Fear Fee Charity. The clerk stated that he had been informed by the Charity Commissioners that the Council might elect 2 representative governors of the Ottery Fear Fee Charity. After some discussion, further consideration of the matter was adjourned to the next meeting. Dedication of the church organ. The Archdeacon of Exeter, the Venerable E.G. Sandford, dedicated the organ which has recently been erected in the parish church on Wednesday. The necessity of a new organ has long been felt, for the old one which stood in and completely blocked up the north aisle was in a very dilapidated condition, and liable to collapse at any time. What portions of the old organ that were of any value have been utilized in the construction of the new one? The erection of the new organ has been one of some difficulty, as it was desired to preserve the architectural beauty of the church, and at the same time to open the whole length of the north aisle. It was therefore found necessary to build it in 2 parts, something on the same style, only much smaller, than the one at Westminster Abbey. One portion of the organ has been placed under one of the chancel arches on the north side, and the other portion under the corresponding arch on the south side. The work of building the organ was entrusted to Messrs. Heel and Co. of Exeter and Plymouth, and has given complete satisfaction. The instrument presents the most handsome appearance. Each portion of it is encased in carved oak, while the whole of the front of the pipes are gilt, and the key fittings are of polished oak. The pedal organ on the south side is worked by tubular pneumatic action. The instrument is played from the north side, and the organist is in full view of the congregation. The contract price for the whole of the work was £500, but there have been some extras. The amount the church authorities asked to be provided was £550, and up to Wednesday morning £511 had been subscribed.